Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we're plunging into some really foundational narratives from the sources you've shared. We're picking up the story right after, the creation account in the fall. We're looking at the very beginnings of human history, the first family. And we've got some great material for this deep dive, audio discussion excerpts, PDF notes, all digging into Genesis chapters 4 and 5. These are ancient texts, right? Super dense with meaning. But our mission here is, well, to go beyond just the surface. We want to pull out those key insights, the sources highlight, connect the dots, and really see what these stories reveal about, well, human nature consequences, and maybe those surprising threads of something more, God's plan, maybe. Think of it like getting a shortcut, a way to get well informed about a really significant story, hopefully with some moments that make you think, aha. Hmm. So let's dive right into Genesis chapter 4. We're squarely in the world after the fall from chapter 3, and one of the first things the sources pointed out was the immediate fallout, the progression after that first disobedience.
Yes, that's a really critical starting point. The material we looked at emphasizes this clear sequence. It started with shame. Suddenly, they saw themselves differently, realized they were naked, felt exposed, vulnerable.
Right, the whole fig leaves incident, where they
Well,
covered themselves up.
exactly. And the sources show how that shame, almost immediately, it morphed into blame. When God confronted Adam, what did he do? He blamed Eve, and actually sort of implicitly blamed God to the woman you gave me.
Uh-huh. And Eve,
Eve then passed the buck to the serpent.
the classic blame game. Nobody wants to take responsibility.
Precisely. And the final step in that chain, according to the sources, was hiding. Shame leads to blame. Blame leads to trying to hide from God's presence right there in the garden. So this whole sequence, shame, blame, hiding, it's presented as this fundamental pattern, an immediate result of that rebellion. And what's really crucial, as the sources kept stressing, is that God wasn't surprised by any of this. He knew. He wasn't caught off guard.
Yeah, and the material goes even deeper, into what was actually lost after the fall. It suggests something really profound was stripped away. A glory, maybe, or some kind of covering.
Mm.
And the sources draw this really interesting link to Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians 5. Paul compares our current earthly body, this physical existence, to a temporary thing, like a tabernacle or a tent. It's described as something that, well, groans. It's temporary, subject to decay, limited. And he contrasts that with an eternal building from God, a house not made with hands, something permanent he longs for.
So the idea from the sources is that maybe the original state, that glory, was like the eternal building, and the fall left us with this temporary groaning tent. That's the analogy the sources use, yeah, to help us grasp the magnitude of the loss. Paul talks about wanting to be clothed upon with that heavenly dwelling, saying specifically not to be found naked. The sources connect that directly back to the shame of nakedness in Genesis 3, the loss of that glorious covering. Paul wants that glory back, maybe even something more glorious than Eden, the sources suggest. And this hope is grounded in something absolutely key that the sources emphasize. God knew this loss wasn't the end. Why? Because he holds the keys to death.
Right, Jesus says he holds the keys to death, hell, and the grave.
Exactly. So while sin brought death into the world, God always maintained ultimate authority over it. Unlike the adversary, right? For him, there's no promise of return from death. Understanding this, that God is sovereign, he wasn't surprised. It's crucial context as we look at Cain and Abel and the darkness that unfolds. It underlines the source's point. Our righteousness isn't in us. It's not in our efforts. It's solely in God and what he provides.
Okay, that's fascinating context. So, carrying that forward, chapter 4 starts with the first children born into this post-fall reality, Cain and Abel. And the sources note this is significant, right? It's the first time life comes indirectly through human parents, though still ultimately from God, a shift from direct creation. And when Cain is born, Eve says something hopeful, like, I have gotten a man from the Lord.
Yeah.
The sources suggest this might be her remembering that promise of the seed from Genesis 3.55, the one who defeat the serpent. She's looking for him, maybe.
It's certainly a plausible interpretation highlighted in the material, yeah.
Yeah.
That hope is there.
So these brothers grow up, and they take different paths. Abel keeps sheep, Cain works the ground, the farmer.
And the sources really, they really dig into the significance of these roles and, more importantly, the offerings they bring. Abel, the shepherd. His role connects to a couple of key themes. First, clothing. Remember, God used animal skins requiring a death to cover Adam and Eve, replacing their useless fig leaves. Second, and maybe most critical here, is sacrifice itself. The sources point to that principle elsewhere in Scripture. The life of the body is in the blood. So for there to be a covering for sin, for acceptance before a holy God, the sources present a bloody death. a sacrifice as necessary. It's the pattern God was setting up.
Okay, so Abel's offering fits that pattern. What about Cain's?
Cain brings the produce of the ground, fruit, vegetables. Now there's life there, sure, in a sense, but no shedding of blood, no death as a substitute. The sources present Cain's offering as, well, basically like Adam and Eve's fig leaves all over again. It's something produced by human labor, from the ground that God had cursed. It represents self-effort, trying to cover inadequacy with human work.
So it's inadequate.
That's how the sources frame it, yes. Inadequate to deal with sin and separation. They draw a really direct parallel to people trying to earn salvation through their own works. Look how hard I worked. Look what I achieved. But the sources remind us of Jesus' words, "Depart from me. I never knew you," even to those who did wonderful works in his name.
Oof, yeah.
So hard work is good. It can help others, provide for needs. But it's not the way to reconciliation with God. That's a gift received only through faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. The sources suggest Cain's offering lacked that faith, that reliance on God's way. It was reliance on self, on the cursed ground's output.
So it really wasn't about God liking meat more than vegetables. It was the whole approach, the heart behind it, what
Yeah.
it symbolized.
Exactly. The sources are very clear on that. God's rejection wasn't arbitrary. It was about the terms Cain was trying to come on, his own terms, bringing the results of his own effort from cursed ground, building on, as the source puts it, shaky ground God had already judged. Maybe, the material speculates, maybe Adam and Eve taught them about sacrifice, but Cain found killing an animal, maybe too brutal. Maybe he preferred his own nicer offering. We don't know for sure, but the principle holds.
And Cain's reaction when his offering isn't accepted,
Mm.
it's intense, very wroth, the text says, super angry, and his countenance fell, dejected.
Yes, that reaction reveals the pride, the self-will involved. But look at God's response. It's pivotal. He doesn't just zap him or abandon him. He confronts him, lovingly but firmly. Why are you angry? Why so dejected? He points the way back. If you do well, respond correctly, you will be accepted. There's a path open to him.
But there's a warning, too.
A huge warning. But if you refuse to respond correctly, then watch out. Sin is waiting to attack and destroy you. The imagery there, the sources highlight it. Sin personifies, like a predator crouching at the door, ready to spring. It desires to have you.
Wow.
But God tells Cain explicitly, you must subdue it. You must rule over it. The responsibility, the capacity, it was his. He had a choice right then.
That pension just hangs there. And then the text says Cain talked with Abel, his brother. The sources wonder what that conversation was like. Maybe Cain arguing, my way is better, less brutal, questioning Abel's method.
It's speculation, of course, but plausible given the context. Whatever was said, it didn't end well.
No. While they were in the field, Cain attacked Abel, killed him. The first murder. The sources just note this grimly. The rapid spread of sin, how quickly things escalated.
And then God confronts Cain again. Where is Abel, your brother?
And Cain's response. First a lie, I don't know. That cold, defiant question.
Yeah.
Am I my brother's keeper?
Yeah, the sources jump right on that. It's the blame game again, Genesis 3 all over. But worse, now it's layered with murder, deceit. Instead of owning up, he deflects, lies, questions his basic responsibility. And the sources make a sharp point. God doesn't argue with a liar. He knows the truth. He doesn't engage in that debate. A liar, the source says, won't tarry in God's sight.
Because God sees it all. He says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. That idea of blood crying out, the sources find it fascinating. How does that work? It's a mystery, they admit.
It is a mystery, but they connect it back to that principle, life is in the blood. So Abel's spilled lifeblood somehow has a voice before God. It demands attention. And this leads the sources to draw this really profound contrast. They link Abel's blood to Christ's blood. Hebrews 12.24, its reference, saying Jesus' blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel.
A better word? How so?
Well, Abel's blood crying from the ground, it symbolizes the demand for justice, for consequence. It highlights the brokenness, the cost of sin and violence. It cries for retribution. But Christ's blood, shed on the cross, the sources explain it, cries out for mercy, forgiveness, reconciliation. So Abel's blood speaks of sin's destructive power, the need for justice. Christ's blood reveals God's redemptive power, offering forgiveness a way back. Justice demanded versus mercy provided.
Wow, that's powerful. One cries for consequence, the other for grace.
Yeah.
So what were the actual consequences for Cain?
They were severe, and the material shows they were directly tied to his actions, his attitude. Cain is cursed, but specifically from the earth itself, not just the ground he worked, and that ground he relied on. It will no longer yield abundant crops from you no matter how hard you work, a direct reflection of his failed self-reliance.
Ouch.
And he'll be a homeless fugitive, constantly wandering, which, the source notes, means he'd have to rely on others, because he couldn't grow his own food effectively anymore.
Cain's reaction is just despair, right? My punishment is greater than I can bear. He's afraid people will kill him.
He is. And here's where the sources point out something really surprising, something that shows God's nature even in judgment. Instead of just leaving Cain to his fate, God offers protection. He declares vengeance 7 times on anyone who kills Cain. Judgment belongs to God, not personal revenge.
He puts a mark on him.
Yes, a mark to warn others not to kill him. We don't know what it was, the sources say. The text doesn't specify. Maybe it didn't even survive the flood. The nature of the mark isn't the main point. The main point, highlighted by the sources, is God's mercy. Protection, even for the first murderer. Mercy operating even within judgment.
Still, despite that protection, Cain's state is one of separation. He went out from the presence of the Lord. The sources called this maybe the most important part of the chapter, a voluntary departure, choosing to leave God's presence.
Exactly, which is such a stark contrast to that deep human need, that desire the sources talk about, to actually be in God's presence, to seek him, know him.
So Cain goes into exile, land of Nod, east of Eden. He marries, has a son, Enoch, and then he builds a city named after his son.
And the sources tackle that question. Where did the wife come from? The material suggests, well, Adam and Eve lived a long time, likely had many other children, sons and daughters. So early on, intermarriage within that first extended family was necessary for humanity to grow, permissible before genetic issues became a concern later.
Okay, makes sense. And why build a city?
Well, think about the curse. The ground wouldn't produce for him. He couldn't farm effectively. Building a city, the sources suggest, was likely a necessity. It forces people to come to him, probably for trade. He needs others to bring him food.
Ah, okay. Which leads into his lineage and what they did.
Right. The genealogy through Cain's son Enoch down to Lamech, and Lamech, the sources point out, takes 2 wives, Adah and Zillah, breaking that one-man, one-woman model God set. The sources even find the name suggestive. Adah means adornment, Zillah may be seductress. They joke it's problems from A to Z in that house, hinting at the moral slide.
And Lamech is known for that boast, right? That chilling poem.
Oh, yes, it's recorded right there. He tells his wives he killed a man for wounding him, a young man for hurting him. Maybe 2 murders, the sources suggest. But what's arguably worse is how he twists God's protective promise for Cain. God said vengeance 7 times for Cain. Lamech boasts that he should be avenged 77 times.
Whoa.
Yeah. The sources see this as just a horrifying escalation, violence, pride, taking vengeance entirely into human hands. It shows how sin wasn't just static. It festered, it grew, it intensified in this line, separated from God.
And his kids' contributions seem to fit that city trade picture.
Exactly. Jobal, father of tent dwellers and livestock owners. Nomads needing tents for travel, probably trade. Jubal, father of musicians, harp, organ, entertainment, another trade or service in a city. And Tubal-Cain, instructor of metalworkers, brass and iron, manufacturing tools, goods for trade.
Always to survive in a city, trading skills for food they couldn't easily grow.
That's the interpretation the sources offer, yes. A society built on human enterprise and trade, born from necessity due to the curse.
So the sources kind of summarize Cain as a type.
Yeah, the first murderer. And the sources note grimly, look around today, killing continues. In that sense, nothing's changed under heaven regarding fallen human nature, echoing Ecclesiastes. The whole Cain and Abel story, the sources suggest, is like a microcosm of redemption history. Cain is fallen humanity, striving through self-effort, succumbing to sin, ending in separation. Abel is the faithful remnant, trusting God's way. Their conflict reflects that bigger, ongoing struggle between righteousness and sin, ultimately resolved only in Christ.
Okay, so that's Cain's line. Sin, separation, violence, human ingenuity apart from God. But let's shift back. Chapter 4 introduces another thread, which chapter 5 picks up. After Abel's death, Eve has another son, Seth. She names him Seth, meaning appointed, seeing him as God's replacement seed for Abel.
And the sources stress this is hugely significant. Seth's line represents the preservation of the righteous lineage. God's redemptive plan continues through this line. This is the line tracing forward to that promised seed from Genesis 3.15, the one who'd crushed the serpent's head, ultimately leading to the Messiah. And the sources note something specific. Adam fathered Seth in his own likeness and image. They interpret this as showing humanity's continued link to Adam, who was made in God's image. So even though sin corrupted it, the image of God persists, and it points forward to its restoration in Christ, like Colossians 3:7 talks about.
And there's that really hopeful note in Seth's line, contrasting with Cain leaving God's presence during the time of Seth's son, Enos.
Yes. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. The sources see this as a major spiritual development, a turning back towards God, seeking him by name. Now, the sources do add a little nuance. Reasons for calling on God can be mixed, right? Sometimes it's deep need, sometimes maybe less pure motives, seeking blessings, not the blesser himself.
Sure, human nature.
Right. But regardless of individual motives, that collective act calling on the Lord's name is presented as positive, a clear contrast to Cain's path away from God.
Okay, so this leads us into chapter 5, which honestly at first glance can look like just a list. The genealogy from Adam to Noah through Seth. Name, age, and he died. Repeat.
It can seem that way, yeah. Dry, maybe repetitive. But the PDF analysis we have really unpacks why these genealogies are absolutely crucial. They're way more than just history. They serve profound theological, symbolic, redemptive purposes. First, the sources call them a vital bridge, connecting Adam, the first man, straight to Noah, the guy who carries humanity through the flood. It's not just historical, it's theological, showing God's faithfulness, maintaining a lineage despite all the sin and death.
So it shows God's plan wasn't derailed.
Exactly. It demonstrates the preservation of God's covenant. It meticulously traces the specific line for that promised seed. Every name in Seth's line is a step, a link God preserves to fulfill that Genesis 3:15 promise. Second, they powerfully show continuity despite mortality, that constant refrain, and he died. It's stark. It hammers home sin's consequence, death entered through Adam, as Romans 5 says. This chapter proves it, generation after generation. But, and this is key, the genealogy also shows life went on. New generations were born. God's purposes kept moving forward right through these people who lived and died. It's a statement about God's ongoing work, even with death in the picture.
Okay, beyond being a bridge and showing continuity,
Yeah.
what else is packed in this list?
Well, like we mentioned with Seth, the genealogy reminds us Adam was made in God's image, and that image gets passed down. Even corrupted by sin, it remains. And that points forward, the sources say, to its restoration in Christ. Believers being renewed in knowledge according to the Creator's image, Colossians 3:0 again. And then there's Enoch. He just jumps out, doesn't he?
He really does. Doesn't die like the others.
Right. He walked in close fellowship with God, or walked with God, and then uniquely he was not, for God took him. No physical death recorded. The sources see Enoch as a powerful type of Christ. He's being taken by God, foreshadows Christ's victory over death, resurrection, ascension. It demonstrates, they argue, that intimacy with God leads to life beyond death, a glimpse of eternity. Plus, the sources note he's the 7th generation from Adam. 7, often symbolizing perfection or completion in the Bible, adds another layer, maybe.
And the ages. We have to talk about the ages. 900 years plus for many of them. That's just mind-boggling.
It really is. And the sources spend some time on this. One obvious implication, massive population growth. Think about it. Living centuries, having sons and daughters, plural, suggesting many kids, the sources estimate the population could easily have hit billions before the flood.
Billions, wow.
It's just math based on the text parameters. And the sources explore potential scientific reasons, too, trying to understand the pre-flood world described in Genesis. One big theory discussed is a pre-flood canopy, maybe a water vapor layer high up. This could have created, they suggest, a global greenhouse effect. Uniform, temperate climate everywhere, no harsh poles, maybe less wind because temperatures were stable.
Okay, and how does that relate to long life?
Crucially, the sources theorize this canopy might have shielded Earth from harmful solar radiation. They suggest radiation is a primary cause of aging today, cellular breakdown over time. If that radiation was blocked,
People age much slower. Cells didn't break down as fast.
that's the theory presented, leading to incredibly long, maybe biologically youthful lives until something else happened. They even mention things like finding frozen mammoths in Siberia with tropical plants in their stomachs as possible, though debated, evidence cited by some for a vastly different global climate before a sudden catastrophe like the flood, maybe when the canopy collapsed. The idea is the biological limits were just different then.
Fascinating speculation,
Yeah.
connecting the text to potential physical realities.
It is. But returning to the genealogy's main purpose, the sources stress it's also a prophetic marker. It traces the specific line to the Messiah through Noah, showing history isn't random, it's moving toward God's goal, redemption through Jesus. Noah, being the 10th generation, is also seen as symbolic. 10 often means completion. The end of an era before the flood brings a new beginning. And Noah's name itself, rest or comfort. His father, Lamech, the one from Seth's line, hoped he'd bring relief from toiling the cursed ground. The sources see this pointing ultimately to the true rest Christ offers. Matthew 11, come to me, find rest for your souls.
So this list,
Yeah,
it's loaded. What's the big takeaway about God and us from Genesis 5?
the sources really frame it as an invitation to trust God's sovereignty. Look how involved he is, working through ordinary people across huge spans of time to bring about his extraordinary plan of redemption. It shows his plan is universal, reaching all humanity through Christ via this lineage. So even this list of names becomes, as the sources put it, a powerful proclamation of the gospel, God's faithfulness across generations. And this loops back to that crucial contrast the sources keep making, gaining knowledge versus seeking to know God.
The tree of knowledge versus relationship.
Exactly. Knowledge is good, valuable. The sources aren't anti-knowledge. But it shouldn't be the ultimate goal, shouldn't replace God. The warning is that the adversary can trick us into chasing godliness, good attributes like kindness, mercy, generosity for their own sake, or for what we get out of them, instead of seeking the person of God himself. Remember Jesus' warning, people did wonderful works, but he said, I never knew you. The relationship was missing.
So it really sounds like the thread weaving through all of this, Cain versus Seth, faith versus works, the genealogy itself is about the absolute priority of faith, trusting God, not relying on our own efforts, our work, our knowledge, what we can figure out, but trusting his way, his promises, especially for things we don't really grasp.
Precisely. Faith is paramount, the sources stress. They ask, do you need faith for what you already know? If you know it completely, no faith needed. Faith is for what you don't fully understand, what you can't prove with your own intellect or senses. The sources even touch on Bible versions, saying God can work through any translation if the reader's hunger is truly for him, and the Spirit gives understanding. It's not just about amassing head knowledge about God or limiting him based on our current science, especially since the pre-flood world was likely so different. As they quote, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. It's about knowing God personally, relationally, like David, a man after God's own heart. Not because he was perfect, far from it, but because his core desire was, oh, that I might know him.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together from chapters 4 and 5. We definitely see two starkly different paths emerging right from the start, after the fall. There's Cain's line, marked by sin's consequences, separation from God, pride, escalating violence, and this focus on human enterprise cities, trades driven by necessity, not necessarily blessing.
And then the contrast, Seth's line, representing the preservation of that godly lineage, marked by calling on God's name, indicating faith, marked by those long lives, God's grace sustaining them despite mortality, and culminating in Noah, the one who carries God's plan and the messianic lineage forward.
Both lines, with that constant "and he died," show the reality of sin and death, no escaping that. But Seth's line, especially with Enoch bypassing death, and the whole genealogy tracing God's promise, points forward to God's enduring plan, his sovereignty, the hope of overcoming death.
Absolutely, it hammers home the source's points. Human effort, self-reliance. Cain's offering, it's insufficient. God's prescribed way, sacrifice pointing to Christ, Abel's offering, fulfilled later, received by faith, that's the necessity. The sources show that despite all the human failure, rebellion, disappointment we see right from the start, God's attributes, his mercy, his care, his goodness, they are constantly active, enabling connection with him and even between people. The absolute key, the sources suggest, is that deep internal desire to know God himself above everything else, rooted in faith, dependence, not self-effort or just knowing about him.
Wow. Yeah, there's just so much packed into these early Genesis chapters when you dig in like this, using the insights from these sources. It's definitely not just a simple story. It's this incredibly rich tapestry showing where so many human struggles come from, the consequences of turning away from God, but also, amazingly, the persistence of his plan and his mercy, always working.
Yeah, we've seen sin cycles start that core contrast between works and faith, and how even a list of names reveals God's purpose across time. The sources really emphasize that God's attributes, his sovereignty, mercy, faithfulness, they're always in action, no matter the human failings.
So as you listening reflect on this deep dive, maybe something to consider for yourself, how do you see that tension playing out in your own life, that pull between relying on your own efforts, your knowledge, what you can control,
Yeah.
versus that call to trust God's way, his promises, especially for what's beyond you? And what is this story, these first generations, their struggles, failures, those long lives, those two distinct paths? What does it tell you about God's incredibly long-term perspective and his continuous personal involvement in our human story. That wraps up this custom deep dive into chapters 4 and 5 of Genesis, drawing specifically from the sources you provided.